So I want to talk about vulnerabilities now. Um, I think going back over my life, my greatest weakness is that I am a thinker, not a doer. Now, in this society that puts cognitive intelligence on a pedestal, you might be saying, "Jace, how can thinking be a weakness?" It definitely was a weakness. The problem is getting stuck in your thoughts and not being able to see delusion. And probably the most frustrating part of it to other people was I thought I was being rationally minded. I would talk about logic and logical fallacies despite, trying to ignore my own contradictions and asking other people to prove them to me. And I got really good at debating the contradictions people would call me out on because I would do that to myself to avoid taking action. Because being a hypocrite really isn't all that bad. Contradicting yourself is bad. Contradictions are evidence of a lack of action on an individual. Hypocrisy is natural. I mean, every child that says they want to be a cowboy and then isn't is a hypocrite. Every single family that said they wanted 5 kids and has 3 kids is a hypocrite. There's no problem with being a hypocrite. The only time we ever have a problem with people being hypocritical is when they're contradicting what they mean. And this is dangerous because when people hold other people to a standard that they themselves are not living, it's probably one of the most difficult things to tolerate. And the thing is I used to blame other people for it all the time. Now, is this just because I'm a natural narcissist and, egocentric and as Jordan Peterson puts it, a hyper intellectual? I was, yes, but I was not a natural one. In fact, I think rarely ever are we natural narcissists, natural egoists, natural hyper intellectuals. It's just become so commonplace that we think it must be, and that some people are just that way. But let me rewind quite a bit to the point in my life when this all started, and I thought more than I did. I was probably around 5th grade. Before this, it was probably an equal balance of thinking and doing. But after 5th grade, I started to realize being smarter is more important than natural skill. And I had gotten by on natural skill. My brain seems to pick up theory better than logical practice. So obviously, this means explaining what I know is very difficult. Proving what I know in a society that bases knowing what you know on evidence became exceedingly difficult to fly by the seat of my pants by 5th grade. So, getting overwhelmed by the amount of evidence that was being demanded of me, because evidence that I could do something was more important than the fact that I got it done. I found the skepticism to be draining. Although I understand why the skepticism was there, there needs to be checks and balances. They needed to make sure that I was checking my own work, which, ironically enough, I was doing in my own mind. And by 6th and 7th grade, I decided that it was the topics at school that just were not my thing. And I started finding my own topics. I didn't care as much about math and science at that point, so I got into theoretical physics because, no one was going to tell me to show my work there. And interestingly enough, I started to be drawn away from topics that most people were taught to care about and most people do care about, to talk about theories that weren't taught in school, from astrophysics to quantum theories to economic theories to social theories to psychological theories, all of these things that just were not the topics taught at school. I was able to do this in the early days of the internet. It was much easier to find valuable information because you just had to find it. It wasn't buried in 10 tons of crap under 30,000 tons of shit. And this is the world we live in now, where we have been bred to react. And I'm not talking about people were bred from, birth. I'm talking about from the birth of the social internet, this pseudo social internet, social medias, the rise of social medias that have brought generations together as equals, which is amazing in its own right, but they trained us to react because that's what advertising requires, is reaction. So unwittingly, these marketing abusers trained us to react because the engineers wanted to make shit tons of money. And it got out of hand real quick, because when you have multiple generations using a platform and everyone is reacting, well, what are reactions? Reactions are not thinking. It is the lack of thinking. Daniel Kahneman talks about this in Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And if you're not being chased by a lion or impending doom, then reacting is quite dangerous in a civilized society. So when you get multiple generations reacting in different ways, what happens is you have all of these generations picking up the bad reaction habits of other generations and creating new reactionary cliques that are cross-generational, cross-mental health level, and you realize that over time you have a degradation of mental health. The leader is always what everyone is aspiring to be, and online it's just the most charismatic, the one who is the most active. It doesn't even need to be the most charismatic, it's the one who needs to be there the most, who is the most active. And that's it. That becomes the alpha. The one who is so bad at self-mastery or self-control that they react to social media at every single notification, and they become the alpha reactors that bring generations together to learn each other's bad habits of reacting. What does this have to do with me? Well, I fell into it hook, line, and sinker. I mean, even despite studying marketing and psychology for years, I fell into it head over heels without even knowing, because the collective was doing so. Multiple collectives were doing so. There's no way that the world getting more connected could ever turn out, well, the way it did. So horribly, horribly upside down. I'm not going to say wrong or bad. We are more connected, but in a way that is like a giant, enormous global cult, where we are creating cults of ego based on who is most susceptible to the reactionary nature of social media. It's like addicts leading addicts. And this is leading us to a society that gives in to the easiest things. We have faux intellectuals. I was absolutely one of them. And I became addicted to explaining. Some people get addicted to watching, others get addicted to explaining on social media. Some get just so turned off by social media, they turn it off. It turns out that they were right all along. Not that it's bad to have a social media, but now it is easier for these people than ever to get in and master it and use it for business, which is really the only thing it's good for anymore. We're so overindulged in digital connectivity. We don't know how to have real world connectivity. Um, I use Wi-Fi wherever I go now, so I run into some interesting experiences not using cellular connections. Like when I was in New York City a few weeks ago on the subway platform, everyone was looking down, staring at their screens, and I realized this it feels like we're in the Matrix, but people are plugged in to their phones through their eye sockets, and the Matrix isn't necessarily something that is all encompassing. It's something that keeps drawing us back in at that point, and it just keeps us distracted. And I remember seeing a mother on her phone and holding the hand of her little boy. And he just looked so bored. And he just wanted his mom's attention, but he was trained not to say anything. He just was looking up at her, waiting for that attention. And I realized me and him were the only ones not looking at a phone. And I realized that I've woken up in a world that none of us saw coming. And my intellectualism was pseudo-intellectual at best. Not to say I didn't know things, I just knew things that people didn't care about, which is frustrating because I also didn't have the community needed to talk to about, you know, ideas and sciences that most people don't even know exist or think are just completely fake altogether because they never got far enough to understand these things, these what I call secret languages of the world, such as psychology and mathematics and code and just secret languages that people don't see, almost like code of the Matrix. They can't see psychology, so they can't see marketing. They can't see math, so they can't see code. And there are these superpower magical forces at play that they just never had much interest in because it's easier to make a buck doing something that isn't so hard for them to learn. And I remember using so many excuses to think instead of do. There's a term called non-starters. I was definitely one of them. I knew way too much to not be doing anything worthwhile, but yet continuously I would let myself fail because I would get something started and not know if it was the absolute best thing for me and quit early. Usually I'd quit just as soon as I started to gain traction with something. And this is probably extremely frustrating for my family and friends, especially those who knew that I knew more than them. And interestingly enough, for years I was terrified to let people know how much I know because, that's not the humble thing to do. That's being self-promoting. Yet I would talk about what I could do when in reality I was less likely to do than I was to know. And I got myself into a lot of troubles. Like, oh my gosh, it was like a sitcom. Like, it was more like a Ben Stiller type sitcom where it was quite depressing sometimes. And I was self-sabotaging and blaming the world for it. And I see this happening all over the place now. And I realized I used to feel so alone. I thought this was such a big secret. And now I realize so many people suffer from this, suffer silently. And it is so painful because it pushes people away. I remember thinking I was so open-minded, but I would require other people to conform to my definition of open-mindedness, where my beliefs, my personal beliefs, had to be validated in order for me to consider someone else open-minded. This is a, you know, I call a pay your debt first type open-mindedness, where I required people to pay a debt that they weren't even aware that I required them to pay, a covert contract of sorts. And I did this all the time and would blame other people for the very things I knew deep down that I was also to blame for. I just wanted them to admit that they were to blame for it first before they called me out on this. I needed that empathy. The trouble is explaining. I thought explaining was my weakness for a long time, but it's not. Listening was my weakness. Even though I used to be really good at listening, and I still could flip on that switch to be really good at listening. But the more I did it, the more I felt unheard, and the more I created a covert contract that that person needed to listen to me or my advice or validate me in some way. And this was dishonest. Not to say that what I wanted wasn't fair. That's more than fair to want that, but to expect it, that's dishonest. I might as well tell them up front, hey, I'm going to listen to what you're going to say, but you also need to listen to and take my advice and thank me for it, or else I'm going to make you feel bad about being vulnerable with me. And I pushed so many people away, so many people that needed help the most, so many people that were just starting to take off that I would listen to, and just as they started to take off, I would judge what they were doing because I was terrified of doing. And my mind tends to see what's wrong with things, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when I only talk about what's wrong with what people are doing when I'm not really doing anything, like, if they don't know that, it feels like I'm judging them. If they do know that, I'm being a hypocrite, and the worst kind of hypocrite, I'm contradicting myself. How dare I give them advice on how to do something when I don't even know how to do things my way? So over the past year, I've been learning from my wife how to do by watching her do. She's a doer. I joke that I'm a thinker and she's a doer. And this may seem insulting to some people in the world because thinking is on such a pedestal when doing is almost demonized now. Risk taking is part of doing, and that's essentially where the demonization starts. Because if we don't take a risk on ourselves, we're never going to get anything done. And if we truly understand that individually, we would be more empathetic and more forgiving of the risks other people take, especially when they are the ones that pay the price of those risks. I think that people are to be blamed when they take a risk and other people pay the price. But this is the type of risk taking that this cognitive intelligent boom of calculated risks overvaluing calculable risks to the point where they need to be absolutely calculable, guaranteed risks. But at that point, guaranteed risks come at the cost of someone else. You realize you're not taking a risk. And this doesn't really matter to most people unless the person doing this has the power to hold you accountable for their faults, which is usually the powerful. Sometimes the rich, but it's always the powerful, and the powerful don't always need to be the rich. These could be industrial titans abusing capitalism with their industrialism model, or it could be, big government type people abusing their power that they didn't get through money, but through popularity and celebrity and democracy. And I come to a point where I realize that I was so busy judging and complaining about these people, I wasn't working on myself. And the more I've worked on myself, the more powerful I realize I am, and that knowing is not the same thing as being an intellectual, because wisdom is the goal of knowing, and knowing is not wisdom. Wisdom is doing. Because knowledge plus action is wisdom. I think it was Socrates or Plato that talked about that. I've heard that quote so many times from so many different sources. I'm not even sure where it's from anymore, but it's so true. And I used to explain it 100 different ways. No, wisdom is knowledge plus logic, or wisdom is, knowledge plus insight, or but in reality it's doing, because long form thought is really the only thing left to do in a reactionary society. The only thing left to do is the hard stuff to think about, the hard stuff to experience, the hard stuff to learn, the hard stuff to discuss, the hard stuff to prove, the hard stuff to, like, getting out and experimenting with life or a science or a subject or a relationship. We're so afraid of failure that we've stopped experimenting. We stopped failing. And when you stop failing, you, ironically enough, stop succeeding. Because anyone who's a success knows that failing is essential. It is the foundation of success. And our reaction is rooted from fear. Everyone's reactions are rooted from fear. Anxiety, depression, all of it roots from fear. We're afraid of a future. We're afraid of the past. We're afraid of people becoming aware of the past, being aware of our secrets. We are afraid of failure. We are afraid of success. We are afraid of what comes next, when in reality, there is only what's next. We can't know what comes next after what comes next. We have to experience what's next to know that. We have to experience what's next to even see that. We can't see anything beyond our own immediate next choice. And we can only ever speculate about anything else, even other people's immediate next choice. We can only speculate on our choices after our next choice. We can only ever speculate on anyone else's choices ever. We can never know what is the best choice for them. And at that point, you realize it's a whole lot less valuable to be gambling on speculating about other people until first you understand how to know thyself.